Okay. So it's an honor for me to be invited to be part of MCC Ontario this past week as you host Sahar and Tarek. I recently found a very powerful quote from Edward Said, Palestinian public intellectual and founder of the academic field of post-colonial studies. Said had this to say about the refusal to speak to the reality that is Palestine and Israel. Because we do not contest terrible misrepresentations in any significant way with images and messages of our own, we are losing thousands of lives and acres of land without troubling anyone's conscience. Today we are about troubling our conscience, collective and individual. Sahar and Tarek are countering public perceptions and media creations with images and messages from their lived reality. Their stories are a powerful reminder of what is true and what we are called to be about as people who care passionately about justice for everyone. Mennonite Central Committee has worked with Palestinian partners since 1949 after the conflict in 1948 displaced over 750,000 Palestinians as refugees. Another violent conquest took place in 1967 when the State of Israel occupied with their military the West Bank, Gaza, and part of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. This military occupation continues to control every aspect of the lives of people living in the United Nations recognized Palestine. MCC is in that part of the world because people have asked us to work with them to support peace, and the situation is desperate. It is our faith that compels us to work with people in the middle of violence in order to find paths to peace. MCC's A Cry for Home initiative is one way people may understand more clearly the impact of Israel's continued military occupation of Palestine. Please check out the numerous resources available online. I have the privilege to introduce these two very courageous young people who have traveled all the way from Palestine and Israel to talk a bit about life in that part of the world. And there's a map here, and I just very briefly wanted to talk a bit about the context. So Tarek lives in the West Bank, while Sahar lives in Jerusalem, which is in Israel. Palestine includes this little strip of land about the size of Kitchener here, called Gaza. Tarek, while living in the West Bank, a part of Palestine, cannot travel to Gaza, a part of Palestine, nor can Gazans leave the Gaza Strip without permission from Israel. Both Gaza and the West Bank are surrounded by a huge wall. Sahar Vardi is a Jerusalem-based activist. She publicly refused her military service and was imprisoned in 2008. Since then, she has been active with Israeli anti-militarist groups and today works as the Israel Program Coordinator for the American Friends Service Committee, and she is based in Jerusalem. Most of her work focuses on the militarization of Israeli society, both around issues of conscription, as well as Israel's military industry and export. Much of her activism is in East Jerusalem, in Palestinian-led struggles against home demolitions, child arrests, and discrimination. Tarek Al Zoughbi is a Christian Palestinian American who was raised in the little town of Bethlehem. He received a BA in Economics and Peace Studies from Manchester University in Indiana and returned to Bethlehem, where he currently works as the project and youth coordinator at WEAM. WEAM is the Palestinian Conflict Transformation Center. Aside from working on an MA in International Cooperation and Development at Bethlehem University, Tarek serves on the executive board of the National Coalition of Christian Organizations in Palestine. So welcome both of you to the space. And Tarek, maybe you can start us in a conversation.
Well, first of all, thank you for having us. It's a delight for us to be here. This is my first time in Canada by I've enjoyed it thoroughly so far, and the weather's been very nice. And thank you for taking this time, especially as some of you are eating your lunch, to hear our stories and engage with us. So, I don't know how familiar you are with the map, but I'll mostly be talking about the West Bank and referring to that as the West Bank and the Palestinian territories, which includes East Jerusalem. So life under Israeli occupation affects most of our life, from anywhere from what you can do, from where you're allowed to go, to who you are allowed to live with and sometimes marry, and to how easy or hard it is to develop, to build things, to move around, and just to enjoy daily life. So, of course, the first thing I'll be talking about is the wall, is the confiscation of land, and is related to that the settlements. So I'm just going to move towards the screen. There. Okay. So I come from this area of Bethlehem. Between 1948 and 1967, we were under Jordanian occupation or administration. Then in 1967, after the Six-Day War, Israel occupied the rest of the territories and remained under their occupation in different ways. And then in 1993, 1995, with the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian Authority was created. But throughout this whole time, from 1967 till today, there was the building of settlements. So what we oftentimes refer to as these illegal communities on Palestinian territories, whether in the West Bank or Gaza Strip, although most of it now is concentrated in the West Bank. And so these are areas within the Palestinian community of the West Bank that Palestinians no longer have access to, nor do they have authority within. And so just around Bethlehem, the little town of Bethlehem, there are a bit over 23 illegal Israeli settlements and a bit over 20 plus illegal outposts. An outpost is the first step of creating a settlement. It's a conglomeration of Jewish Israeli settlers who come to the land and start trying to build these more permanent or concrete buildings and grow in number until they are recognized as settlers or as a settlement. And then when settlements become too large, they are then recognized oftentimes by Israel and the Israeli government as cities and no longer referred to or seen as settlements. But so just around Bethlehem, you have close to 120,000 illegal settlers on a little bit over 50% of Bethlehem's historic land. That's not to say that the Palestinians have control of the remaining 55%, because you also have military bases, you have a buffer zone between the settlements and the wall or the Palestinian territories, and you also have settlement roads. So in terms of land, Bethlehem only has 13% of its historic land that's under Palestinian authority, that Palestinians can move fairly freely within and build freely. And so this is also in part because of the division of the areas between Area A, B, and C. Area A and B nowadays being under the Palestinian Authority for the most part, and having the rules or the legislation of the Palestinian Authority as well as the security enforcement. Area C under the Israeli occupation. And so that's where you see all of the settlements, and that's where you also have a select few Palestinians living there. There's a population of anywhere from 150,000 to 450,000, depending on the center or the research that you're looking at, and depending whether they include East Jerusalem or not, because East Jerusalem has close to 300,000 Palestinian Jerusalem residents, which is another issue that I'll get into in a little bit. And so what we have in Bethlehem is we have a lot of the olive groves, we have a lot of the agricultural land, which is a very important socioeconomic source of income for many families behind the wall, with that access for Palestinians restricted to those areas, which then decreases the ability to generate income and increases unemployment and poverty. The food insecurity of the West Bank and Gaza Strip is close to 1/3 of all households and families. And if we're talking at risk of food insecurity, it's also 1/3 of households. So we're talking about 2/3 of all households in the Palestinian territory of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem, at risk and suffering food insecurity. And this number is climbing, especially as we see different organizations defunded, such as UNRWA, which is very important for the refugee camps. In terms of unemployment, in Bethlehem, we have the highest unemployment of the West Bank at close to 32%. And in part, this is because so much of the agricultural land is taken. Close to 60% to 67% of Bethlehem's land is Area C. And so those are the areas which are, for the most part, under Israeli control. And that also means that to build in Area C, you need Israeli registration and licenses to do so, which is very hard to come by. And so the Palestinians living there, other than not having adequate access for the most part to water, to electricity, and to infrastructure, they also have limitations on how much they can build, which causes many of the people in Area C who can still access that area to come into Bethlehem and live there, which is why we have such a large population for the small size of land, close to 180,000 people in Bethlehem, and the prices of land have gone up while the wages have continued, which has caused a very poor economy and is increasing the number of those impoverished. So these are some of the things that are directly related and indirectly related to occupation. And so travel restrictions, even access to education, is limited depending on where you live and by the daily occurrences. So while you have Area A and B still under Palestinian Authority control, at any point the Israeli army, and usually this happens more at night when they are coming into Bethlehem or other parts of the West Bank to take people or to just terrorize that neighborhood or community, but oftentimes taking especially young children and young men to Israeli administrative detention centers. And so in regards to some statistics, which I apologize are a bit depressing, but at the moment we've had a little bit over 1 million Palestinians imprisoned by Israel and placed in administrative detention centers. And so statistically, that's 1 in every less than 3 men, and this includes little boys. And so one of the laws that Israel has that they changed from when they had the British Mandate of Palestine was that every Palestinian is guilty until proven innocent, assuming, and when we refer to Palestinian, we're mostly talking about Palestinians without Israeli citizenship, because then there's a different set of laws, military law versus civilian law. And so with that, Israel has the right to hold any Palestinian under the age of 16 for up to 6 months of administrative detention. So that's where they can be interrogated, and they don't have the right to a legal guardian. They don't have to be convicted or accused of a crime. They don't have right to legal advice or a lawyer, and they don't have to appear in court. And so there are mass infringements upon their rights. And also, for security reasons, a lot of it isn't shared and it's kept confidential. And so there's a lot of wide abuse and mistreatment within those administrative detention cells. And that 6 months is renewable in the name of security to up to 60 months. And so as a child, you can go in, you can be charged with nothing, and you can stay up to 60 months for security reasons. But then you also have the chance to actually be charged and accused of something, and then go from an administrative detention cell to an actual prison cell. And so at the moment, we have a little over 6,400 Palestinian prisoners, and we have close to 400 Palestinian kids under the age of 16 in these administrative detention cells. And so part of my work with WEAM is actually working with trauma coping on a general level because of all the violence that we endure, but also specifically with those people and persons, children and youth especially, who have been subject to this mistreatment and who have been put into these administrative detention cells and these prison cells. Seeing a lot of faces frown and that sort of thing, but we're a very resilient people and we're very able to overcome, but we'd also like to not have to overcome, be able to live. And so with the Israeli settlers, talking now about my Christian identity as a Palestinian, one of the many struggles that we face is this identity crisis. We are Palestinian Christians who like to belong to the wider Christian church, the wider Christian community, but most of the time we feel abandoned and betrayed. Those who have heard me speak will already have heard this, but we oftentimes say Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but Christianity is not of Palestine. It's this foreign entity. And part of this is because of many of the political positions which these churches take, which are oftentimes against Palestine. But even if there's no position, we say silence is complicity. And silence has always helped the person who's the victimizer, not those who are marginalized. And so, as Leonardo da Vinci says, silence strengthens power, strengthens authority. And so with this, it's very important to us as Palestinian Christians to be able to broach the Christian community. And this is one of the reasons why MCC is so important to us. There's this loss of identity, there's this loss of hope, and then we have these Christian voices, select few, who are still willing to speak out against what is going on. Even if it's on a certain subject, not to a full extent, but they're still able to speak out. And it's very disheartening when we're going and we see all these settlements, we feel the settlements' presence with the settler violence, with the restrictions on land, and then we hear that this church in the US or this church here and there helped support the Jewish settlers in building some of these settlement projects, which are directly affecting the Palestinian people and the Palestinian Christians of the land. And so it's very important to us that we're able to reconnect with our Christian brethren and we are able to work towards a better future, which takes a lot of courage. And so one of the very important things to me on this tour is that MCC is giving us the platform to be able to speak about our struggles, to be able to speak about our realities, which oftentimes will contradict what you see on your news networks and what you hear, sometimes in your churches, a lot of times in the schools, in the universities, and in general social media and TV news networks, that sort of thing. And other than this, it's also allowing us to engage with these people. We've spoken at churches and now at 2 schools and have been able to engage with the students. And now we're speaking to you, who I believe most of you are MCC staff, but some of you come from other parts. I know at least one of you is a pastor, and hopefully are able to bridge more connections, are able to share our narrative and our story, and also find the courage to work for a real solution, which is very difficult and takes a lot of time. But I'm gonna somewhat close, and we'll be speaking a lot more tonight in more detail. This is just a small teaser. But I hope and I encourage you to keep building connections, to keep your work, to work with these very difficult, complex topics, and to not shy away. And more importantly, I encourage you to encourage your country, your community, your local church and school to have these visits, and exposure meetings with MCC, with MCC's partners, and with the local people of Palestine and Israel. And then, with what you learn, with what you hear, move accordingly. So, thank you very much for listening, and thank you.
So good afternoon. As was said before, my name is Sahar, and I think that what I'm going to try to do is, after hearing from Tarek a lot of kind of what are the realities of occupation, what does it mean to live under it, what does an occupation actually look like, what I'll try to do in not very long is explain what allows it to happen in some way, because I think it is important to understand most of the policies that Tarek was talking about are implemented by a group of 19-year-old Israeli kids. Right? There's mandatory military service for both men and women, meaning the people who actually implement the occupation are 19, 20-year-old kids. And I think it's important to try to think what creates a situation where they, I don't want to say choose, but they find themselves in that place. And sure, mandatory service is part of it, but it's a very small part of it. When we talk about kind of what creates militarization, it's far more than laws. It's a culture, it's an education. And it starts really from the most basic things of kind of what do you see around you on the streets? How many weapons do you see around you on the streets, right? We grow up used to seeing assault rifles just, with soldiers or even sometimes with civilians walking down the streets, right? That's not something that people should get used to seeing. But it gives you a specific feeling towards the military, a specific feeling towards weapons as something that is normal, as part of everyday life, and it's something that is positive, that is about security. I'll actually dare say that I think that generally in most societies, the relationship towards guns can tell you a lot about the power structure of that society. So many times what you will see is, for instance, your automatic feeling when you see an armed police officer. We can have criticism about this, and I assume in a Mennonite setting, we can talk about criticism of militarized police, of guns in public space, but I am going to assume that the majority of people here in the room, and I dare say the majority of white people here in the room, when they see an armed police officer, you're not afraid, right? You can have criticism of it, but you're not going to be scared, because we are raised around the idea that weapons are for our security. They're supposed to be there for us. If I would ask people of color the same question in different communities, not necessarily the same answer, right? And in our case, that would be Palestinians. When they see guns, they're afraid because they are raised with the idea that these guns are supposed to be a threat to them. And kind of how we perceive guns really tells you a lot about the power structure of that society. Who's on what side? Are you supposed to feel secure by this, or is this supposed to be a constant threat towards you? And so we grow up with this idea that military is about security. More than that, military is about the identity of the state. One of my favorite examples of this was a worksheet given to kids to teach them how to count. So, you have like 5 boxes and you'd connect it to the number 5, only not with boxes. It had like tanks and airplanes and the symbol of the Israeli military. And the same piece of paper has like doves and olive branches. And Knesset, our parliament, it has the flag of Israel, the symbol of the state. If I were to ask you what's the common denominator here? What the person putting it together, what were they thinking? Any suggestions, guesses? Nothing? No common denominator? The amazing thing for me is that you give that piece of paper to Israelis and they're all like, oh, that's Israel. We know how to recognize it, right? The symbols, the institutions, peace, who doesn't want peace, and the military. It's part of what the identity of the state is. It's how you visualize it, right? What the state of Israel is a militarized solution to anti-Semitism, right? If you really think about it, the concept was, if there is anti-Semitism, what we need to do is create a state where we have the monopoly of violence, right? Where we have a strong enough military to make sure that that never happens again. The core of what the state is a militarized concept. And so we live through that. And there's a lot of thing that feeds into that. The fear that we are brought up on as Israeli Jews. Again, there's a million examples of how that's constructed, but one of my favorite ones is a month between April and May in the Hebrew calendar that starts with Passover. And I assume in this crowd I don't need to explain Passover. Right, so the Exodus from Egypt. I don't know if you know this, but Passover is seen as the first place, or it is the first place that the term Hebrews or Israelites is used. Right, before that there's only individuals. This is the first time we talk about a group is under slavery in Egypt, and then the Exodus from that. Right, so it's a nation-building exercise. And does anyone know what the main commandment of Passover is? This is where I always lose Christians. So the main commandment is to remember. It's a holiday that's about remembrance, and you're supposed to tell the story from generation to generation. And like many things in religion, different people will tell different stories, right? Well, what is it that you're supposed to remember? And the kind of go-to narrative that we all grow up in Israel is what you are remembering. There's actually a song that I'll translate for you because I think it's a good example of that. It translates into, in every generation someone tries to exterminate us and then God saves us from them. Right? That's what you're learning. That's why you need to tell this from generation to generation. It's a precautionary tale. Now, a week after Passover ends is the Holocaust Memorial Day. Exactly a week after that is the Soldiers and Victims of Terror Memorial Day. And the following morning is Independence Day. right? And if you like, that is a snapshot of Israeli mindset, this idea that everyone has always tried to kill us, and obviously the Holocaust being the worst example of what that can look like, and it's ongoing. People are still fighting and people are still dying, but there's an answer at the end of it. There is a state. There is something that will keep you safe. And one of the really sad things that I think that this narrative creates, beyond the fact that we are just a society that lives in fear, is that if this has always happened, if this is an ongoing 3,000-year-old thing that just is, then there's no solution. Then there's no point about talking about sustainable solution. There's no point about talking about peace, right? The only solution that Israel can give is a strong enough military to make sure that doesn't happen. Right? That's not sustainable. We don't think even in those terms. We think in terms of survival. And I think if you look at Israeli lived experience, it is exactly the opposite. This is always shocking to me that we never think about the fact that in the history of Israel, there have been 2 countries that have ever actually been at war with Israel and posed an existential threat to Israel. Anyone know what those countries were? So Egypt and Jordan. Egypt and Jordan are the only countries who've been in that situation, been at war in Israel, and were strong enough to actually pose a threat. And in both those cases, literally from the day that peace accords were signed, that was it, right? Nothing has happened since. I can go visit Petra and see the beautiful, if I want to go to Egypt, that's fine. So literally the lived experience of Israel has been that peace-based solutions are what creates sustainable security, but that's not part of our narrative. So it's not part of how we think about things, of how we think about solving things. And I think that this gap between most Israelis will still say they want to see a peaceful solution, they want to see possibly a 2-state solution, they want in some ways to see the end of occupation. But the way that we're taught, we're educated, kind of tells us that's not really a possibility. And I think a lot of when we kind of try to think what is our role in trying to change that, it's how do we step into a place where, first of all, that is actually really on the table, and where we get to gap or kind of bridge the gap between what people say that they want. So everyone says they want peace, right? I don't think I'll ever be able to walk into a room and say, is anyone against peace here? Everyone says they want peace, but at the same time, as humans, we have a tendency to cooperate with the opposite. And it's not only true in this. It's so many things in our lives that we have our political agendas or ideals and values around, and we live our lives a little bit differently, right? That's a thing we all do. And I think that's what we're seeing on a political level in the context of Israel-Palestine. I mean, vast majority of the world thinks the occupation should end, recognize that settlements are illegal. I mean, every government, including the government of Canada, traditionally US governments, I'm not gonna say anything about the existing one, but that's always been the kind of consensus. And at the same time, these countries are happy to turn a blind eye to what's actually happening, to continue diplomatic relations as usual, and we're just talking about this today, to sign big cooperation agreements with Israel, including military agreements that include trainings that are based on the use or on developing techniques against Palestinians and then coming to train forces here on how to use those things. Israeli companies that are building defense and surveillance around it in Palestine, in occupied territories, that then your government will use for surveillance and fencing in the prison systems here. And so there's this double standard, this gap between what people say they think should be a solution or what it could be towards what we're actually doing, what's happening on the ground. And I think for me, especially, I mean, the reason for me to speak about these things abroad is to ask, how do we bridge that gap? I think that the first thing that we have to do is understand, where are we complicit in these things, right? We were talking about this quite a lot, but the the CPP, right, where your pension funds money are going. And that includes, for instance, Elbit Systems, Israel's biggest military industry, privately owned military industry, that is responsible for drones, including drone attacks in Gaza, that's responsible for building surveillance around the fence, and all of these things. And I mean, all the people in this room are literally making a profit out of that, right? That's what it means that your pension fund is invested in it. And so I think the first phase of understanding where are we complicit and how we can stop that complicity, and then from there move towards how can we also be creating positive change. So I'm gonna leave you at that. I know that some people will have to leave and have some schedule issues, but we will be happy to stay with whoever can and have kind of more of a conversations and questions.
Thanks. So we have another, I think, 15 or so minutes, and we're going to take this time now for questions. So please feel free to ask Sahar or Tarek anything. And they, any appropriate thing, and they will respond.
Please remember, you need to use the mic. Katie's got the mic.
Sahar, I know it was referred that you were in prison for refusing military service. Could we ask you a little bit about that? Like, that's very foreign to us here, of anything we would experience. And I wondered if you could speak just for a minute about that experience for you.
Of the military prison itself, or the whole process?
Yeah, whatever you would want to share on that.
Sure. I mean, it is important to say there are a lot of ways out of military service. Some of you might remember a period where people dodging the draft in the US would come to Canada. That used to be a thing. So for us, instead of going to Canada, you can get out on mental health issues. That's usually the easiest way out. And so that there's different ways to try to get out of military service. And then there are people, including myself, who choose to actually publicly say why we're refusing and say, I am refusing because of the occupation, knowing that that's not recognized by the state. And that's something that's ongoing. There's always been, literally since 1948, there's been refusal to the Israeli military. At the moment, we have a kid in prison who's there for the last, I think it's almost 3 months now, and will probably continue for a few more terms. And so that was part of my decision as well, together with a group of friends who are also active and in the same age group. We decided to refuse to make a public statement out of it, and send it to, Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, a whole line of people who never read it. And eventually, because of that, we're imprisoned. So the process is that you are imprisoned for somewhere between a week and a month in a military prison. And you are legally a soldier. So you're treated as a soldier, and then you get your prison sentence, you serve it, and then you get out and get an order saying, go back to your military base, continue your service. Then you go back and you refuse again, you go to prison again, you have this game back and forth until the military is kind of fed up of you and says, okay, well, we get it. And so you never really know for how long you'll be in prison. It is important to say this is a military prison for Israeli soldiers. It is very different in its conditions than the prisons that Palestinians are in, which are also military prisons, but for Palestinians. And so our conditions are relatively pretty good. It's a little bit like boot camp, just without the guns, more or less. So it's about discipline, and you stand in line a lot. It's very boring, but it's not, it's not a dangerous or very oppressive system, other than the fact that it is a prison. The one thing that is important for me to say about that space is that it also tells you a lot about the internal gaps within Jewish Israeli society. So the majority of soldiers who are imprisoned in military prisons are imprisoned because they literally can't afford to go to the military. So Israeli soldiers don't get a salary, they get a stipend. It's depending on your position, but between a tenth and an eighth of the minimum wage, right? So obviously nothing. Which means that if you are part of an income of a family, you literally can't afford to go to the military. But you have to by law. So what happens is that people are drafted, get a phone call from home saying we're not finishing the month, and go home to work, right? And legally speaking, desert. and eventually find themselves in military prison. So I do think it's important to say the majority of population, military prison population, is that. And that's, it's kind of another whole phenomena of, again, what does militarization actually mean for us as a society? It's not only something that Palestinians pay a price for, obviously they pay the highest price for it, but as a society, we have a lot of prices to pay as well.
Thank you both very much. I appreciate so much what you're both doing, the peace building efforts you're doing. How would you answer the question when people ask you, Iran wants to obliterate Israel off the face of the earth, and other countries, other allied countries as well wants to do that. How do you respond to that? Obviously there's lots of atrocities within the military itself and what they're doing, but overall, they're trying to defend themselves from these countries that are saying, we've got missiles pointed at you, we are ready to obliterate you at any moment. How do you respond to that?
You can start, I'll follow.
A very good question. I will try and give an answer. So I think there's actually two questions in that question. Maybe one about threats, and then the other one about the reaction to supposed threats. And I think that's very important for me. Because, there's also, when you talk to some Israelis who have ideologies that help them support settlements or help support the occupation, you also hear the term of Palestinians wanting to push the Jews into the sea. Or like Golda Meir and what she said, if Arabs only loved their children as much as they loved war, I'm paraphrasing a little bit. And so I think, yes, there are threats, maybe. I don't think they are as large as they are said to be. Especially, if we're talking about Iran, Iran has capabilities. If it wanted to do anything to Israel, it would have already happened and we would have already been in a war. Iran probably would have lost. Israel has nuclear capability, nuclear warheads. It has a very strong defense system. It has very strong allies. I mean, just the states alone. It's the #1 army in the world, I believe, in terms of might. And so Israel has these good defense systems. But if we're talking about how Israel reacts to these things, the wall is one of the barriers that was built, I would use for the pretense of protecting security. So the wall was built between 2003, 2005, and is still being constructed upon in different regions, and there are different plans for walls. Not just the wall we have, but walls to come. And they're built in a way that most of the wall, a little bit close to 80%, 85%, is actually built on Palestinian land within the West Bank. And so regardless of whether the wall was truly built for security or not, from the Palestinian perspective, no, it was built to grab land. I am of the belief that if I want to build something to defend myself, it should be on my borders and shouldn't be also an offense on the other people or the other people's borders. And so what this wall did, it divided the Palestinian community. And other than this wall, you also have these settlement roads, some of them which are inaccessible for Palestinians that go through Palestinian villages, through Palestinian areas, between Palestinian areas, dividing the people. And there are also buffer zones around settlements. And so there's often, if we look at geometry and circles, I'm not very good at math, and I don't know if anyone here is a math major or something, but you have the circle, and then you have an outer layer. If you're able to grow 1 inch in the circle, then you have to grow 1 inch in the outer layer, but the circumference of that outer layer is much larger. And that circumference is being used to take a lot more land. Because now we have one more settler family or one more unit being built, and now we can take land worth 3 or 4 settlement units just for that buffer zone for protection, and we're taking it from who? The Palestinians time and time again. And if we look at Israel and the geography of Israel and the outlay of cities and villages, there's still a lot of space within the Israeli-controlled territories and within the Israeli territory of 1967 for expansion. But with the settlement, with the wall movement, it's definitely a movement to occupy more land, to take it, and to make it much more difficult for Palestinians to exist, to have a viable state, and to continue to survive under the current situation or circumstance. And so one of the reasons Area C is targeted, and this is something Sahar told high schoolers yesterday, I believe, is because there's a lot less of a Palestinian population and a lot more land in those areas. So let's take the land, but let's not take those people with that land. Whatever they do, that's up to them, but so this is a quasi-answer to your question, and Sahar will do a better job.
I mean, just to add to that, I think that we often kind of get that concept of there is generally a threat as a way to justify occupation, and I think it's important to divide the two things. I mean, if your boss threatens to fire you, you don't get to go and beat up your assistant. Like, those two things are not connected. And I think that often we kind of fall into that place that if we're talking about a paradigm of security, then everything is legitimate within it. And we should be able to say, okay, if we want to talk about possible threats from Iran, then let's talk about Iran. What do the Palestinians have to do with this? So that's one differentiation that's important to make. The other one is that if we do want to fall into this kind of realpolitik discourse that I think sometimes is actually more constructed than true, but even within it, the most sustainable security solutions offered to Israel in the past few decades have been, for instance, the Saudi initiative, an initiative that comes and says, you end the occupation, you solve the issue with the Palestinians, and you also get peace accords with, I don't remember exactly how many countries that involved, but it's something like 20 Arab countries in the neighborhood, and something of the sort. Like, this is about sustainable security. There's nothing about continuing the status quo that really allows Israel security.
I think I'm going to just add one more thing about that I completely forgot to mention, and that's the permit system and different identification of Palestinians and privileges that they have. And so one of the examples of what we call the matrix of control or the systematic oppression which Israel forces upon us is we have this narrative that Palestinians are not allowed to access Israel to protect the Jewish people of Israel and then to protect the Israeli people of Israel. But within Israel, there are also Palestinians living. Within Jerusalem, there's close to 300,000 Palestinians who are not Israeli or Palestinian by citizenship by law. But then you also have the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza Strip who aren't allowed to access Israel unless they have a permit. And this is where it gets interesting, because the permit's only given to those who have cleared security. They're not a threat to Israel, but yet the permit isn't given across the board. It's given for specific days, for specific times. So for instance, if you're over the age of 26, Palestinian, and you are married, you can now pay what would equate to close to 300, a little less, Canadian dollars per month and get this working permit. The working permit, if you work from 8 to 4, you are able to enter and access Israel from 7, maybe 6:30 if you have to go through one of the very busy checkpoints until 6 o'clock. So you're only given the permit to be able to enter Israel and to work. If one day you have the permit because it's for the whole month, but you don't have work, you're not able legally to access Israel for that day, even though you have the permit. The same for those who are not working, like myself, a Christian who has been lucky to receive a permit for holidays. Not that there should be a permit system, but I'm one of the Palestinians who's privileged in receiving that. But I'm not a threat, I'm not a terrorist or a security risk during the month of Christmas and during the month of Easter. The rest of the time, I go back to my nature, something like that. And so this is the type of system that is being used systematically to punish, oppress, and keep that matrix of control. And within that, you know, the Jewish calendar is clear, the holiday calendar is very clear, but if I have the permit for September, and there's many Jewish holidays in September, then my ability to enter Israel is revoked at the checkpoint to protect the Jewish Israelis during their Jewish celebrations. Even though they're well marked on the calendar, they're not marked into the permit, so that I have to go to the checkpoint and then be rejected. So it's an affirmation of the imbalance of power and Israel's control over the borders, in a sense.
Last question? Or not?
So
So I'm just going to go here. So I'm going to encourage you to come tonight